Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. Which AWS service can AWS CodeDeploy use for automatic scaling during deployments? AWS Step Functions, Amazon SNS, AWS Batch, AWS Auto Scaling. AWS CodeDeploy can integrate with AWS Auto Scaling to automatically adjust instance capacity based on deployment needs. What happens to instances in an all-at-once deployment strategy in AWS CodeDeploy? Updated sequentially. Updated simultaneously. Updated based on instance type. Updated after manual approval. In an all-at-once deployment strategy, what does an application revision represent in AWS CodeDeploy? A version bundle of application files. A CloudFormation stack. An instance type for scaling. A security group for EC2 instances. An application revision in AWS CodeDeploy is a snapshot or bundle of versioned application files ready for deployment. What is AWS CodeDeploy primarily used for? Deploying applications to Amazon EC2 instances. Analyzing logs with Amazon CloudWatch. Managing Amazon S3 buckets. Sending emails through AWS SES. AWS CodeDeploy is a service for automating application deployments to a variety of compute services including Amazon EC2 instances. How does AWS CodeDeploy know whether a deployment has succeeded or failed? Using deployment lifecycle events and health checks. Checking DNS records. Reviewing IAM policies. Analyzing firewall logs. AWS CodeDeploy determines deployment success or failure through lifecycle events and health checks configured during deployment. What deployment strategies are supported by AWS CodeDeploy? Serverless and microservices. And blue/green. Rolling. All at once. FIFO and LIFO. What does AWS CodeDeploy use to verify successful deployments? AWS CloudTrail logs. Amazon RDS snapshots. Deployment status checks and health checks. Elastic load balancing metrics. AWS CodeDeploy verifies successful deployments using deployment status checks and health checks configured during deployment. How does AWS CodeDeploy manage application rollbacks? Updates IAM policies. Automatically reverts to a previous version. Pauses deployment for review. Sends notifications for manual rollback. AWS CodeDeploy manages application rollbacks by automatically reverting to a previous version if deployment issues occur. What AWS service allows AWS CodeDeploy to deploy applications on-premises? AWS Storage Gateway. AWS Snowball. AWS Snowmobile. AWS OpsWorks. AWS OpsWorks allows AWS CodeDeploy to deploy applications on-premises using an integrated approach. What is a deployment lifecycle event in AWS CodeDeploy? An AWS Lambda function. A stage in the deployment process triggering actions. An Amazon S3 bucket. A CloudWatch metric. A deployment lifecycle event in AWS CodeDeploy represents a stage or step in the deployment process that triggers specific actions or checks. Which AWS service is often used in conjunction with AWS CodeDeploy for continuous integration and continuous deployment? AWS Code Pipeline. AWS CloudFormation. AWS CodeCommit. Amazon ECS. AWS CodeCommit is often used alongside AWS CodeDeploy for managing source code repositories in CI/CD pipelines. What does the traffic shift feature in AWS CodeDeploy allow you to do? Gradually direct traffic to a new version. Redirect DNS queries. Update IAM roles. Scale instances automatically. The traffic shift. How does AWS CodeDeploy handle application deployment errors? By restarting the deployment process. By increasing instance capacity temporarily. By automatically rolling back to a previous version. By notifying via email alerts. AWS CodeDeploy handles deployment errors by automatically rolling back to a previous version if issues occur during deployment. What is the benefit of using AWS CodeDeploy with auto-scaling groups? Automates Amazon S3 backups. Optimizes Amazon RDS performance. Reduces AWS service costs. Ensures deployment across dynamically changing instances. AWS CodeDeploy with auto-scaling groups ensures deployments across dynamically changing instances. What deployment method does AWS CodeDeploy recommend for production environments to minimize risk? Blue/green deployment. Canary deployment. Rolling deployment. All-at-once deployment. Blue/green deployment is recommended for production as it reduces risk by maintaining separate environments for old and new versions. What does AWS CodeDeploy do during a blue/green deployment strategy? Deploys a new version alongside the existing one. Deploys all instances at once. Deploys to a single availability zone. Deploys to random instance IDs. During a blue/green deployment strategy. Which AWS CodeDeploy deployment method verifies the new deployment's health before fully deploying? All-at-once deployment. Rolling deployment. Blue/green deployment. Canary deployment. Canary deployment in AWS CodeDeploy verifies the new deployment's health on a small subset of instances before proceeding with full deployment. What is a deployment target in AWS CodeDeploy? CloudFormation stack for deployment. Resource for application deployment. IAM user for deployment. DNS server for route updates. A deployment target in AWS CodeDeploy refers to a specific resource or set of resources targeted for application deployment. What is a best practice when defining IAM roles for AWS CodeDeploy deployments? Create IAM users for each deployment. Use root account credentials. Grant least privilege access. Share IAM roles across accounts. A best practice for IAM roles in AWS CodeDeploy is to grant least privilege access to ensure security and minimize risks. Which AWS CodeDeploy deployment type involves updating instances in a rolling fashion? Canary deployment. Rolling deployment. All-at-once deployment. Blue/green deployment. Rolling deployment in AWS CodeDeploy updates instances in batches. Which AWS CodeDeploy deployment configuration allows you to deploy to Amazon ECS services? Amazon ECS. Elastic Beanstalk. EC2/on-premises. Lambda. The Amazon ECS deployment configuration in AWS CodeDeploy supports deployments to Amazon ECS services. What does AWS CodeDeploy allow you to do regarding failed deployments? Automatically roll back to a previous version. Manually restart the deployment process. Notify via SMS messages. Disable future deployments temporarily. AWS CodeDeploy allows automatic rollback to a previous version in case of failed deployments. What does the hooks section in an app spec file define? Database schema changes. Load balancer configurations. CloudFormation stack updates. Actions to execute at different stages of deployment. The hooks section in an app spec file defines actions or scripts to execute at different stages of the deployment process in AWS CodeDeploy. What is the typical deployment flow in AWS CodeDeploy? Launch instances. Register application. Create deployment group. Deploy revision. Configure load balancers. What does the compute platform represent in AWS CodeDeploy? IAM role for deployment. Target environment for deployment. CloudFront distribution configuration. Instance scaling metrics. The compute platform in AWS CodeDeploy represents the target environment. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.